Somewhere in a garage right now, someone is kneeling by a wheel, checking the tread on a tyre with a familiar name stamped into the rubber. Dunlop. It has been on cars, on bicycles, on the feet of tennis champions, on the wings of Spitfires, for well over a century. What that person kneeling by the wheel almost certainly doesn't know is that the company that put that name on the tyre no longer exists. Hasn't existed since 1985. What they're touching is a badge. A name, licensed out, stitched onto a product built by a company that isn't British, wasn't founded by anyone named Dunlop, and had nothing to do with the invention at all. There are easy explanations for what happened. Cheap foreign competition. The death of British car manufacturing. Bad luck in the 1970s. All partly true. None of them the whole story. Because underneath the easy explanations is something narrower and stranger. A pattern that runs through this company from its very first day to its last. A habit of walking away from the thing that made it valuable, right at the moment it mattered most. It happened at the beginning. It happened at the worst possible moment in the middle. And it happened again at the end. To understand how a name recognized on every continent stopped being a company and became a sticker, you have to go back to the man who never even wanted to be in the tyre business. His name was John Boyd Dunlop, and he was a vet. Not an engineer, not an industrialist. A Scottish veterinary surgeon practicing in Belfast in the 1880s, more comfortable around horses than machinery. In 1887, his 10-year-old son was struggling to ride a tricycle fitted with solid rubber wheels, jarring over the cobbled streets outside their house. Dunlop, tinkering in his surgery, built a rubber tube, wrapped it in linen, fitted a valve improvised from other equipment lying around, and inflated it with air. His son rode off down the street faster than any of the other boys on the block. Dunlop patented the idea in 1888, and by 1889, a small Dublin operation was turning it into a business. Here is the detail to hold on to, because everything that follows traces back to it. John Boyd Dunlop did not think his own invention was worth much. He believed there was no serious future in it. So when a cycling promoter named Harvey du Cros came to him with an offer, Dunlop simply signed his rights away for a small stake and a modest cash sum. And by 1895, he had walked out of the business entirely, gone back to his veterinary practice, taking almost nothing with him for an idea that would eventually put rubber on every form of transport on Earth. The company would keep his name on the door for the next 100 years. The man himself would never own a meaningful piece of what that name became. Hold that walk-away moment in your mind. A founder handing over the one thing that mattered, for far less than it was worth, at the exact moment it started to matter. Because that is not a one-off story about a modest Victorian vet. That is the shape of the next century. What du Cros built from Dunlop's abandoned patent was, for a while, a genuinely remarkable business, though not without turbulence from day one. Du Cros flipped the company for a fast profit to a financier named Ernest Terahuli, who dressed it up with aristocrats on the board and sold it on again within months for a tidy markup, pocketing the difference before the tyres had even improved. It survived that kind of speculative churn and kept growing anyway, because the underlying product was simply better than anything else on the market. By 1900, it was making car tyres. By 1910, aeroplane tyres and golf balls. By 1917, with war production demanding rubber at a scale nobody had needed before, the company built an enormous new factory on 400 acres outside Birmingham. They called it Fort Dunlop, and at its peak, it alone employed 10,000 people. Then came the first real brush with catastrophe, and it is worth pausing on because the fix that followed became the company's peacetime template. In 1919, a financier named James White took control of Dunlop and gambled heavily on the rubber futures market. The price of rubber collapsed. Quality slipped at the same time. In August of 1921, the company announced a loss of £8 million for the year, a staggering sum for the period. And Dunlop came within a hair of collapse. It was rescued by outside investors, and a new chairman was brought in to clean up the wreckage. Sir Eric Geddes, a railway administrator with no background in rubber at all. Geddes did something that actually worked. He diversified. Rather than betting everything on one product in one market, he pushed Dunlop into tennis balls, golf equipment, and, in 1926, waterproof clothing, buying the famous Macintosh brand. By 1928, tyres had fallen from 90% of the company's turnover to just 72%, and that was by design. A business that made money 4 or 5 different ways couldn't be sunk by one bad year in one market ever again. It was, in its own way, the opposite of the mistake that would eventually kill the company decades later. And that contrast matters. This management team understood risk. They had already lived through what happens when a company puts everything on one bet and loses. The strategy paid off spectacularly. Through the 1920s and 30s, Dunlop opened factories in the United States, Canada, France, Germany, South Africa, India, and Japan. In 1929 came Dunlopillo, a latex foam that would end up inside sofas and mattresses in homes that had never owned a car. By 1930, Dunlop was the 8th largest public company in Britain by market value. During the Second World War, Dunlop rubber sat in the joystick grip of the Spitfires that fought the Battle of Britain. And afterward, the company pioneered Maxaret, the world's first anti-lock braking system for aircraft. Technology so effective, it would eventually find its way, decades later, into every car on the road. By 1946, the company employed 70,000 people and sold in nearly every country on Earth. By 1955, Dunlop held very close to half of the entire UK tyre market. Picture what that meant on the ground. In Birmingham, in Erdington specifically, where Fort Dunlop stood. Whole families worked there across generations. Shift change was a city-wide event. Thousands of workers moving through the gates at once. The surrounding streets built up specifically to house them. It wasn't just a factory. It was the reason the neighborhood existed in its current form at all. This was the world's largest rubber company, the inventor of the product category, sitting at the absolute peak of its market. Nothing about the next crisis would come from bad luck. It would come from a choice. In the early 1960s, tyre engineering was about to change permanently, and everyone in the industry could see it coming. The old-style cross-ply tyre was on its way out. The question was, what would replace it? A radial tyre. Radials lasted longer, gripped better, and used less fuel because of lower rolling resistance. A genuine leap forward, not a marginal one. But there were 2 ways to build a radial. You could reinforce it with textile cord, which was cheaper and easier to manufacture using equipment factories already owned. Or you could reinforce it with steel belting, which cost more to tool up for, but produced a tyre that was significantly tougher, more durable, and better suited to the higher speeds and heavier cars coming onto the roads. Dunlop chose textile. Michelin, its French rival, chose steel. It looked, on the balance sheet in the moment it was made, like the sensible decision: lower capital outlay, faster to bring to market, less disruption to the factories that already existed. But it was a bet on the tyre staying roughly as demanding as it already was, made at the exact moment cars were getting faster, heavier, and driven further. Steel-belted radials turned out to be the future the whole industry needed, and Dunlop had built its production lines for the tyre the industry was leaving behind. This is the second time in this story that Dunlop gave away the thing that actually mattered. The first time, a founder signed over a patent because he didn't believe in it. This time, an entire company signed over its technical leadership because retooling was expensive and the cheaper path was sitting right there. Michelin's steel-belted radials began eating into markets across Europe through the late 1960s and into the 70s. And Dunlop found itself playing catch-up in the one area, tyre technology, where it had once set the pace for the entire world. Compounding it, in 1971, Dunlop merged its international tyre operations with the Italian manufacturer Pirelli, forming what was briefly the third largest tyre company on Earth, behind only Goodyear and Firestone. On paper, it looked like scale solving the problem the radial mistake had created. In practice, the joint venture never worked. The two companies' operations tangled instead of combining, decision-making slowed rather than sharpened. And Pirelli's side of the arrangement lost money for most of the decade it lasted. In 1981, after 10 years of friction, Dunlop and Pirelli quietly dissolved the partnership and went their separate ways, leaving Dunlop no stronger against Michelin than when it started, and considerably poorer for the attempt. Then the ground gave way entirely from underneath. From 1972 onward, the British car industry that Dunlop's domestic tyre business depended on went into a long, ugly decline of its own. Fewer cars built in Britain meant fewer tyres needed from a British tyre maker. The 1973 oil crisis hit next, driving up the cost of the petroleum-based raw materials rubber manufacturing depends on. At the exact moment Dunlop's revenues were already strained by the wrong bet on radials and the failed Pirelli marriage. 3 separate blows, landing on top of each other, on a company that a decade earlier had been racing to keep pace with a rival instead of setting the pace itself. By the late 1970s, the pattern was visible in the numbers. Between 1978 and 1981 alone, Dunlop spent the equivalent of over $100 million trying to modernize its aging European tyre plants, pouring money in simply to catch up to where it should already have been. And the debt taken on to fund the fight was starting to define the company more than its products did. The chairman who had steered Dunlop through the 1970s, Sir Rie Geddes, son of the man who'd rescued the company from ruin 50 years earlier, stepped down in 1978, and a new chairman, Sir Campbell Fraser, inherited a business that was no longer choosing its own direction. It was managing a shrinking set of options, one debt payment at a time. One decision, made at a boardroom table in the early 1960s to save money on retooling, had cost Dunlop its technical lead over its biggest rival. Everything from here, the layoffs, the asset sales, the loss of the name itself, traces directly back to that afternoon nobody remembers, when the cheaper radial looked like the responsible choice. The debt didn't go away. It compounded. And a company carrying debt it cannot outgrow only has one kind of decision left to make, over and over again. What to sell next? Between 1978 and the mid-1980s, Dunlop's British workforce was cut from 13,000 people down to 7,000. Nearly half, gone, in a period of a few years. George Angus, a subsidiary that made industrial hoses and had nothing to do with the crisis, was sold off simply to raise cash. The company's own rubber plantations, the very source of its raw material, were sold too. Each sale kept the company alive for another year. Each sale also made it smaller and less able to earn its way back out of the hole. In September of 1983 came the sale that tells you exactly how far the company had fallen. Dunlop sold its entire European tyre business. The operation built on the technology the company itself had invented. To Sumitomo Rubber Industries of Japan, for £82 million. Sumitomo had originally been Dunlop's own licensee in Japan decades earlier, a junior partner learning the trade from the master. Now the junior partner was buying the master's European operations outright. The following year, 1984, the remaining tyre factories in New Zealand and India were sold off too, for £200 million. The company quite literally selling the ground it manufactured on, region by region, to stay solvent. And then, in 1985, came the number that closes the loop on everything. The industrial conglomerate BTR bought what remained of Dunlop, the entire company, the name, the badge, the 100-year history, for £100 million. Almost immediately afterward, BTR turned around and sold off just the American tyre arm on its own for £142 million. Read that twice. The single piece BTR sold off after the purchase was worth more than the price BTR had paid for the whole business. Dunlop, by 1985, was worth less as a complete company than the sum of its parts sold separately. That is not a company in decline. That is a company that has been fully hollowed out, still standing only because nobody had finished dismantling it yet. Picture the town this landed on. Erdington, Birmingham. The streets built up around Fort Dunlop's shift change whistle a generation earlier. Families who had worked there across 2, sometimes 3 generations, found the plant they'd built their working lives around no longer belonged to a tyre company at all. It belonged to whoever currently held the debt, or the deed, or the highest bid. The people who had made Dunlop worth something were, once again, the first thing sold off to satisfy a decision made years earlier, in a boardroom, about a tyre they'd never been consulted on. What happened after 1985 is less a company history than an inventory. BTR itself decided in 1996 to stop being a sprawling conglomerate and sold Dunlop's sporting goods arm, the tennis and golf business, Slazenger included, for £372 million. Within 8 years, that division was resold again for a fraction of that price, £40 million, to Sports Direct. Dunlop's aircraft tyre business, the descendant of the technology that once armed Spitfires, was sold off separately to a group of private investors in the same year. In 1998, BTR sold Dunlop's aerospace division for £510 million. That business changed hands again in 2004, sold on to Meggitt for £800 million. Meanwhile, the road tyre business, the actual Dunlop tyre, the one people still bought, kept moving too. Sumitomo and the American giant Goodyear formed a joint venture in 1999 that split rights to the Dunlop name between them. Goodyear took Europe and America. Sumitomo kept the rest of the world. In South Africa, Dunlop tyres were bought by India's Apollo Tyres in 2006, who, by their own later admission, were never fully committed to the brand, and sold most of what they'd bought back to Sumitomo in 2013 for a fraction of what they'd paid. Every single one of these transactions was, on its own terms, a rational business decision by the company doing the selling. Strung together across 4 decades, they describe something else. A name being passed hand to hand between owners, none of whom had built it, most of whom didn't particularly want to keep it, until nobody remaining could tell you with a straight face who Dunlop actually was anymore. In fairness to every executive in this story, Geddes, Fraser, BTR's board, Apollo's leadership, none of them set out to destroy anything. Each one was managing the wreckage left by the decision before it, under real financial pressure, with real jobs and real debts to weigh against each other. The oil crisis wasn't their fault. The collapse of British car manufacturing wasn't their fault. Even the original radial decision in 1961 or so was a reasonable bet made with the information available at the time. Nobody signs off on a strategy believing it's the one that ends the company. That's precisely what makes the pattern worth noticing. It never took a villain. It only ever took the cheaper option, chosen honestly. At the one moment, cheap was the wrong answer. So what is Dunlop today? Depending on where you're standing in the world, the answer is different. Buy a tyre in parts of Europe, and it may be made by Goodyear. Buy one elsewhere, and it's Sumitomo. Buy a Dunlop tennis racket, and it traces back to Sports Direct. Buy Dunlopillo foam, and you're looking at yet another owner entirely. The name is the same everywhere. The company behind it is not, has not been for 40 years, and in most cases was never British to begin with by the time you picked the product off the shelf. It is, in the truest sense, a badge, sewn onto whatever product whichever current licensee happens to be making, in whichever country happens to be cheapest that year. Go and stand at Fort Dunlop today, the actual building outside Birmingham where 10,000 people once worked. The rubber processing machinery is gone. The shift change whistle is gone. What's there now is an office park, refurbished, reopened in 2006 with shops and a hotel on the ground floor. And in 2001, while the building sat empty awaiting redevelopment, someone had the idea to drape its enormous grade-listed facade in an advertisement. Not for a tyre, for a Ford Mondeo. 130 meters wide, visible from a mile down the motorway. The largest advertising poster in the world at the time, wrapped around the walls where Dunlop had once built the rubber that went under cars just like it. The building that invented the modern tyre, wearing a billboard for someone else's car, because it no longer had a product of its own to put there. That image is the whole story compressed into one wall. The factory still stands. The name still exists. On tyres, on rackets, on foam, in more countries than most companies ever reach. But the thing that made Dunlop worth anything, ownership of its own invention, control of its own technology, a stake in what it actually built, that had already been given away 3 times before the building itself became a billboard. First by a vet in Belfast who didn't believe in his own patent, then by a boardroom in the early 1960s that chose the cheaper radial, and finally, piece by piece, by every owner after 1985 who inherited a debt-loaded name and did the only rational thing available, sold off whatever still had value, to whoever would pay for it. Here's the thing worth sitting with. None of the 3 moments looked like a mistake when it happened. Signing away a patent you don't believe in is just being honest about your own limits. Choosing the cheaper tyre technology is just sound cost management. Selling a division for more than you paid for the whole company is, on that day, simply good business. It's only later, decades later, looking at a badge stitched onto someone else's product, that you can see all 3 moments were the same moment, wearing a different suit each time. The story of Dunlop isn't really about tyres. It's about how 100 years of small, defensible, individually reasonable decisions to let go of the thing you actually own can add up to nothing being left to hold on to at all. If your own company, or your own career, has ever quietly let go of the one thing that actually made it valuable, because the alternative looked expensive, or difficult, or simply not worth the fight that year. Tell me about it in the comments. I read everyone. The badge is still out there, on a tyre in someone's garage right now. It'll probably outlast every company that's ever owned it. That, in the end, might be the strangest part of the whole story. The name survived. Almost nothing else did.